Hi there. Last week, looking at shame, the last 2 or 3 weeks, last week we looked at the sources of shame. I suggested 5 possible sources. 1, the advertisements and expectations of our cultural society that bombard us every day. The opportunistic bullies and abusers in our lives. Our well-intentioned but sometimes unaccepting, unaffirming parents, the graceless religion that many of us grew up in, and all of that combining to create shameful messages that come from the inside of us. It's not external shame, it's stuff that we create ourselves. So what do we do with all of this shame? Where do we find healing for this shame? And I'm going to suggest to you that we find that healing from God. Not the God of shoulds and oughts and judgment and condemnation, but the God of grace and peace. One of the reasons I think we struggle with dealing with our shame, and Lou Smedes taught me this in his book, Shame and Grace, we need to distinguish between unhealthy shame and then healthy guilt. Guilt because we did wrong, we failed, and we need to confess that. Shame says, because you failed, you are a failure. You are no good. You have no worth, no value, and we need to confess that as well. Let me see if I can explain this using a story from the Bible. It's in Luke chapter 7. Jesus is invited to dinner at this really famous religious guy's house, and the town prostitute crashes the party with this big jar of happy perfume and begins to pour it over the feet of Jesus and wiping it up with her hair and just giving herself to Jesus. And while she's pouring perfume on the feet of Jesus, the really important, famous religious guy is pouring out shame on the prostitute. What is she doing here? Who let her in? She's not good enough to be in my house. She's surely not good enough to be in the presence of Jesus. Get her out of here. Now, this dear girl not only has healthy guilt because of her lifestyle and the choices that she has made, but now she has unhealthy shame being poured out on top of her, and she brings both of that, all of that, to Jesus. With her shame and with her guilt, she comes to Jesus. In spite of her shame and in spite of her guilt, she comes to Jesus. She brings all of herself to Jesus. How does Jesus respond? Does he yell at her? No. Does he scream at her? No. Does he give her a lecture? No. Does he say to her, "What is wrong with you?" No. Does he say, "You've got to get your act together, girl"? No. Luke chapter 7, verse 48, check it out, 11 words. Your sins are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And maybe there's someone listening today who needs to hear those words. In the midst of your chaos, in the midst of your fusion of healthy guilt and unhealthy shame, you need to hear the words of Jesus. Your sins are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. I hope you'll join me again next week. We'll look at another episode of Jesus and some people struggling with their shame and their guilt. And again, we'll see what Jesus has to say. God bless. You're in my prayers.